What I would like to do, again, welcome our panelists this evening. Very good welcome to the ICD, and I think we'll go straight into it. I like some opening views or perspectives because it helps to warm the discussion. So, again, if with not much ado, Mr. Quirin from Quirin, Montana, since you have dealt with this field of African leadership, what will be your views of the future of African leadership and also the opportunities, because you did talk about bridge building for youth education and much more so professional development?
Thank you. From my perspective, the world is changing. Everybody is aware about that. But the world is changing even faster in Africa. Ambassador from Burundi talked about the Arab Spring. What starts during the Arab Spring first in Tunisia is not only a North African phenomenon. It's not only an African phenomenon. It's really a world revolution which are starting at this day. And we know we can comment on the results of this movement. But today in Tunisia, a first democratically elected government rules the country. And these changes, these expectations, people on the street at that time, they were not fighting to get power. They were just fighting for getting civil liberties. And this is a major change. There was no leaders. It was a spontaneous movement that will affect the whole world. So then there are two options. Either governments, we are talking about Africa, but it's not only an African consideration. Either governments take into account the true expectation of youth today, the true expectations of generations that are a way of wellness, that are a way of getting a chance to raise its family, to have a chance to get a job, to have a chance to access education. One day or another, these leaders will be put it out about this generation. So it can be done peacefully, it can be done sometimes with violence, but things must change. There are so many conflicts that are existing for decades now. And when I talk about this conflict, this situation with young people coming from all over the world, they have very simple expectations. They want to live peacefully, they want to contribute to building a world which is better balanced, which is more respectful towards environment, which is more open-minded toward culture. And the role of organization like ICT, like the format at different level, is to allow this dialogue to start and to help things to change in this world. And the role of young generation, especially in Africa, when more than 50% of the population is aged below 18, it's the major challenge of Africa, but it's also the major treasure of this continent.
Thank you very much. I'll take from your experience, Mr. Barros, if we may, in your experience in the corridors of power in Guinea-Bissau. You've had the opportunity to see the revolutionary African leadership from Nkrumah, Kenyatta, etc. And then within the void, we have, again, as we spoke yesterday, the flaws in certain African leadership. So what would you say, learning the mistakes from the ideal, the euphoria of the ideals of the revolutionary Nkrumah and others, to the flaws in between? What kind of projected platform is needed, or would there be needed some kind of rearrangement of how we prepare African leadership for the future?
Yeah, thank you. I think they are a very big challenge for African leaders and or head of states, and also the politicians. I think since they begin to create the African Union, they was thinking and they create the capacity and the wellness for the people of Africa. But to arrive there, there are very big steps has to be done. Is why I believe always in the regional integration before we arrive at the African Union. Because the objective of the regional integration is to create, to develop our member states. And as experience I had with those communities, concretely in West Africa, that we have ECOWAS and we have what we call EMOA, is West African Economic and Monetary Union, with joined by 8 countries share the same currency. It's about 104 million inhabitants. That it allows to create one space that we can give the possibility to young people to have a job, them your country alone, because we have a free movement of citizens in our member states, and they are a big market, and we need to innovate. But for that, we need to create or to define the priorities. That is, we must to train our young people in the basic of creation of job. So the market is there, the job market is there. We need to improve to create the possibility and the flexibility for the market in order to allow us to transform, to process our product before we export them, instead to export the raw materials. Yeah. Thank you.
I would, again, sensitively move. We had an excellent conversation yesterday, and I think we can take a leaf from His Excellency, the former Prime Minister of Iceland. You made a very valid point, which I felt if a lot of the stakeholders had applied maybe 20, 30 years, it could have stymied the corruption. And it's the example of the Nordic states in the way they engage with Africa. And it was, you notice that they are corrupt elements over there. So your engagement with them is not in terms of allowing that corruption to be exacerbated. You had another methodology. Do you feel this provides the climate of what you spoke about yesterday? I'll let you unpackage it, of being able to give a platform for much more proper leadership, or the development of a future African leadership with integrity and not the flaws that have today, based on our conversation we had yesterday?
Well, I'm not going to judge the leadership of Africa. It's a long time since I was actually engaged in the southern part of Africa because of our development cooperation. But corruption I saw, and you see corruption in many places of the world, and this is something that the countries of Africa are fighting, and nobody can fight that but themselves. But what has struck me in this discussion about Africa now is all these young people, that you have 50% of the nations, if you're talking about Africa as a whole. Now, Africa is not one country, it's 55 countries, if I'm right. So there are different circumstances, but what is common, that it's all these young people. And that must be the main challenge, to find work for them. For example, in my country, we think if we have an unemployment of 7–8%, that's very high. It is now between 3 and 4, and we still think it is too high. In Europe, we are talking about unemployment by young people up to 25%. And this is, of course, terrible. And I can't see, actually, how this is going to be solved for Africa with all these young people. education is good, it's fine, but you have to build up the infrastructure. It was said here that it would cost $200 billion to build up the electricity system. And you said that is not very much, and I agree with you, that it isn't very much. I was telling the students today that subsidies in fisheries in the world are $35 billion a year. And what do you think that is leading to? Over-exploitation of the resources all around the world. For example, in Africa, there are subsidies in foreign fisheries in Africa, and I would say destroying these resources in a way. So everything is relative, and I think it is a great responsibility now, not just for the African nations, but also for the world community, like the World Bank and the UN, to help them to build this up. Because there is a moment now, I have not heard as much about peace in Africa as now. Usually you are hearing in the news mostly about conflicts, killing of people and so on. But there is a relative good stability in Africa today. Of course there are some conflicts, but there is overwhelming peace. So this is a moment to grab, and this is a moment to build trust and invest in the infrastructure. It will be impossible to get work for all these young people with an infrastructure of electricity for 30% of the population. If I remember right, when I was last in Malawi, I think it was 6% there. Maybe it's up to 10 now that have electricity. This is a simple fact. And I think it is very important that we grab this moment to build up the infrastructure. We have the same problem in Russia. I think the biggest poverty line in the world is between Finland and Russia, in Karelia. And why is that? There's an infrastructure on the Finnish side. There is no infrastructure in Russia, for example, to utilize the forests. And they don't know who is the owner of the land. And if you don't know the owner of the land, nobody is utilizing the land. So that is a question one has to solve. So a poverty line is sometimes built up just by the system. And that was built up in the Soviet Union and Russia. And of course, this is also a problem in many places in Africa. But I'm no expert on Africa, I'm sorry to say, but this is what has struck me listening to you today and yesterday.
Thank you for your contribution. Mr. Mark Donfried, you have both in content and with a lot of energy created and brought it into a reality, cultural diplomacy. And much more, you have, unlike some organizations, you've given focus to the development of young leadership, and you've seen them come all around, not just from Africa, but from other parts of the globe. How would cultural diplomacy play a very vital role, especially when we begin to see the old model, the current model of education, not only in Africa, but globally, becoming slightly dysfunctional in its ideals and its utility? As such, it being used as a tool for preparing effective leadership that would have another visionary application in molding an Africa which can reduce the flaws and the tensions, most of these traditional things. What role would cultural diplomacy play in the future of African leadership, in youth, in their education, maybe unpackaging a new paradigm, and also in professional development? And I would try to index it, that most African professional development goes into either be a lawyer, be a doctor, be an accountant. But we know even in those professional capacities, it's not open-ended. How would cultural cultural diplomacy be able to expand and create new paradigms for the future African leadership?
Excellent question, and I'd actually also prefer to hear the comments of the youth on that question, since I am also not an expert on Africa. But I'll give you a brief comment where I want to quote one of my classmates in college, and I always quote her when it comes to this issue. Her name was Lauryn Hill, a very famous singer, also a member of the Fugees, you probably have all heard of. And I wasn't the only Columbia graduate to start an NGO. She actually also, around the time when she came out with the album The Score, which is one of the most famous albums from the Fugees, she also started a nonprofit called the Refugee Project. And when Lauryn started the Refugee Project, her vision was really clear. She would always say the main difference between human beings in the world is not race or ethnicity or nationality or even gender, but it's access. Some people in the world have access to what they want and what they need. Some people don't have access. Maybe it's access to human rights, civil rights, education, food, peace, many things. That was the filter that she used to look at the challenges of the world, which I think is very relevant today, especially when we talk about Africa. We have all the resources we could imagine and dream of there. We have the talents, we have the expertise, everything is there. It's very often really this issue of access. So that would be what I would argue as a small contribution to the discussion. That's the job of actually local, national, and global governments. If they're doing their jobs, normally they should be there making sure their citizens have access to what they need. So that might be one contribution also that cultural diplomacy could make to try to make it a little bit easier to facilitate access, especially when it comes to opportunities such as the topic of this conference, which is why we're doing this conference, education, professional opportunities. That's where I think cultural diplomacy can make, I think, a significant contribution to help enable that access, to really empower the youth and actually the young leaders of Africa. So that's a small comment, but I'd defer to the audience, who I think is more qualified to answer.
Well, what we'll do, since we got brevity of time, we've got opening comments, I think I'll put something just as a backdrop. It will be very contradictory, most probably controversial, but let's say after 400 or 500 years of Africa testing different models of development, we could come to a point that it's not been able to catch up with these different models of development. Maybe, maybe not, and like I said, it's controversial. And maybe we could suppose that Africa has actually been preserved. It's been preserved and it's not been able to catch up, so that at this particular time, when it starts to develop, it could have an assessment of all the models which globally have moved, and it will be able to take the strengths and the constructiveness of those models, but at least walk away from the flaws. I mean, Africa does not need to pollute its rivers, it does not need to pollute its land, it does not need certain other commodities to learn from those societies that have those problems and are grappling with them. So we start from the premises that Africa has a chance to get it right, knowing its great potential. What kind of leadership can we do if they now have the open, unfettered place of getting it right in the future of Africa, in the youth development, in the professional development, and in education? If Africa has to get it right, which way would they go to get it right? This way, we're not lumbered with saying the flaws of education or the flaws of development or the corruption. Let's start from a playing field. They're starting now with well-meaning people on the face of the earth, stakeholders, and starting from looking at the development of an Africa that now has a view of not being able to advance in world models, but has been preserved, that when the chance is to develop, they can develop with the foreview or the hind view of getting it right. And I think I now open the discussion to the participants, knowing that we've got quite short time to do this. But again, we are looking at the future African leadership. We can't afford for them to have the flaws of the present. We're looking at professional development, and like His Excellency from Burundi did say, in agriculture, in the other sectors, even the professionals find it difficult to participate. And generally, we're looking at the consequence of the current model and content of education, which causes a lot of people to graduate, but there are no opportunities for them to impact effectively in their national building or society. So if we can have a few questions again from the panelists, if we do want to speak on that.
We have 9 minutes, so I would say let's hear as many voices as possible. What I would really love, if we could just have brief comments, questions, really to hear what issues do you see as being important, what questions do you have. Let's take a round. My colleague maybe can help with the microphone. As always, if you can briefly introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, that would be great. And hopefully we can hear as many voices as possible. Don't be shy.
Again, you got to understand this is in-house. Like His Excellency from Iceland said, we're no experts on it, but we're well-meaning individuals seeking a solution.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just comment on two things, especially on the African leadership. By this, I think we should think of a kind of intergenerational, building. To try to reduce the gap between generations. Because in some African countries, youth is not involved. And there seems to be a conflict between generations where those who are now leading don't want to involve the young to get the experience. And another issue I would talk of is to have a vision. We have to know where we are going. We have to know the resources we have and how we can use the present, even the past, to prepare our future. So I think it's important, and the education will be there to help us move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other? There's a contribution from the back.
Thank you so much for raising the point that you just raised. Well, my name is Amin. I'm from Morocco. It's a country situated in North Africa, for those who don't know. So one of the perks of, in my opinion, one of the advantages of lagging behind is that you got to see and learn from other experiences. For example, Africa is now lagging behind in comparison to Europe and the United States and all the developed countries. So one of the advantages of being at the bottom is that you can see successful stories, they can see successful people, you can see successful countries and how they became successful, and you can follow that path. For example, if I want to transcend the stairs and I saw you do it, I'll do it better than you if I don't know how to do it. You see what I mean? Because I will learn from you. And if you did a mistake, I will try to avoid that mistake. So I believe that Africa it can advance at a short period of time because there is a lot of experiences that they can rely on. And yeah, that's the point. I think you get it. I don't need to keep talking. So thank you.
Are there any other contributions? And while we're doing it, for Mr. Quirin, you made a very vital point about the African mind right now not being fettered or bogged down with all these other complications. It would find in a global market the way to move forward. Maybe you can unpackage that. Maybe that could be a way forward. And I know you explained it, but just for the benefit, maybe that could stimulate some more thinking, that this mind is no longer unfettered with all those setbacks and those difficulties. It wants to do. That gentleman who is trading in Bangladesh. Maybe you can unpackage, because as a bridge builder, you've had that first contact with that kind of a mind.
How can I say? You were talking about the fact that somehow Africa is preserved of haven't implemented totally the systems. The same way I was saying that the historical economic relation, sometimes based on domination, on humiliation, between Western countries and Africa is totally exhausted. The solutions in Africa will raise from African people. Of course, there are cooperation there are exchanges, there are dialogues that needs to be maintained and encouraged between different parts of the world. The fact that there is no African countries represented at the Security Council, the fact that most of the natural resources, I mean the revenues of natural resources doesn't profit directly to African people, these things, this is my opinion, must change, but will change, because people in Africa will not accept anymore this unbalanced situation. And I'm pretty sure that even concerning the African leaders, they will all have to take into account these new expectations from new generation that once again are not fighting for powers, they are just fighting to find their place in their country and in the world. You see, for instance, what happened with the, just a small example, with the ICT networks. In Africa, they go straight to mobile phone. There is no landline communication system. There is no this kind of infrastructure, which means that they will have their own way of creating an environment which is favorable for their own communities. And I'm always a bit embarrassed when we talk about developed countries, underdeveloped countries. This is not the right way to address this relation and these issues, because we are all, as Europeans, I'm living in countries which has implemented models which brings to overexploitation of limited natural resources, which has bring inequality between many people, frustration. And the worst thing about that is that we have established this model as a universal model, which is not, because there is not enough resources to extend this model this way. Of course, we can be proud of many of our values, of many of the benefit that we can all enjoy in our countries. But I mean, the solution of this new model will, I'm sure, will raise from Africa, from Asia, from South America, because they will all learn from our own mistakes. And this is a deep source of hope for me.
Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming. I'd like to thank again the guests for coming. And on that note, I think we can take it that not only Africa, but any group of people upon the face of this planet, until they assert and take their destiny into their own hands and begin to have creative solutions with integrity, respecting other cultural values, the conversation would go on in their lack of realizing their potential. And in his words, Africa must also develop its own creative solutions for its future leadership, for the youth, for education, and its professional opportunities. Thank you very much for being very attentive.